Now the lotus blossoms, remember that's on that little altar in front, the lion and ram. This name is found also behind the four sons of Horus on the Joseph Smith hypocephalus, which I believe is figure number 6. It refers to the three aspects of the sun: the rising sun, the midday sun, and setting sun. That is Ra, Kefri, and Atum. So those coincide together. He says there is a common type of funerary stela which the Egyptians were wont to set up before the entrances to their tombs, and which served to identify the grave owners, call them to the remembrance of the living, and establish ties between the spheres in which the soul may live. The top of these modest monuments is usually rounded and presents some of the same motifs appeared on the round hypocephali, such as our Facsmilie 2. Thus, the stela of one limbus figure, figure 11, its half-circle top displaying the solar disk and the outspread wings that signify the expanse of the heavens. That's figure 4. Begins the inscription by distributing the owner's complex being in various realms. His Ba in heaven, in the presence of Osiris, his mummy, written with the seal and glory sign, among the exalted ones. His heir flourishing on earth in the presence of Geb, upon his throne in the presence of the living, his name perpetuated upon the mouth of those who live after him by virtue of the book of passing through eternity. Of particular interest is the mention of the Kabasu, a famous text on the coffin of a daughter of Psammetichus II, calls upon certain Kabasu in Heliopolis to witness the birth of one who will take the helm of government and reason with you, ye star reckoners, concerning the secret teachings of the great court of the gods, and who will also receive Osiris into his ship of 1,000. What is all that about? Well, according to Wurcherbuck, these Kabasu in Heliopolis are the expanse of the starry heavens as observed from Heliopolis by the great seer, and provide reckoning of time at the new year. Their name is written in the ideogram of a ship, signifying for some reason that its soul is 1,000-fold, the 1,000 referring specifically to the collectivity of the starry hosts. So if you look, this is jumping into figure 4. Basically, if you look just over to the side, to the left of figure 2, there is what looks to be a hawk with its wings spread out on a boat, if you notice, that are really close to the one that God is sitting on in figure 3. So we've jumped into figure 4 now. A mummiform hawk with outspread wings seated upon a boat represents either Horus Sopt or Sokar, both hawk gods, which are symbolized by a mummiform hawk. Jehorak suggests that it symbolizes the resurrection of the body or soul, but this does not seem to be very convincing to me. One outstanding feature of this figure is its outspread wings, which are not normally found in representations of these two gods. Some connection with Horus, the personification of the sky, seems clear. The association with Sokar, the ancient god of Memphis, is even more interesting. In the festival of Sokar, which was celebrated in many parts of Egypt, a procession was held in which the high priest would place the Sokar boat on a sledge and pull it around the sanctuary. This procession was symbolic of the revolution of the sun and other celestial bodies. Unfortunately, no texts have come down to us explaining this symbolism in more detail. Joseph Smith sees here symbolism for the expanse or firmament of the heavens, which concept, as stated above, the Egyptians often represented by a hawk god, especially Horus. Also, Joseph's explanation that this figure represents the revolutions of Kolob and Abelish agrees favorably with what we know of the symbolism of the Sokar boat in the festival of the Sokar at Memphis. So it does actually connect up, because Joseph Smith comes in here and says, figure 4 answers to the Hebrew word Rao Ki Yang, signifying expanse, or the firmament of the heavens or the sky, also a numerical figure, in Egyptian signifying 1,000, answering to the measuring of time of Abelish, which is equal with Kolob in its revolution and its measuring of time. So remember, that's kind of reference back to figure 1. So figure 4 is another form of the same god as in figure 3. another hawk in transitions. Remember, figure 3 is a hawk-headed god. Number 4 is a winged hawk, basically. Fortunately, professors Gabala and Kitchen have made a thorough study of this figure. He is Sokar, and the new year is his time, marked by various archaic New Year celebrations. At Karnak, the whole complex would seem to be dedicated to the renewal of the Divine King in terms of the festival of Sokar, and the said feast, or Jubilee, the emphasis is on the king and his renewal. The idea is most potently symbolized in this figure. The bird on the boat is rising with outspread wings, shedding the mummy wrappings that still envelop its legs. This is Sokar's great festival, as our authorities tell us. Fused with that of Osiris, everything is at an end but the next day. The first day of the new year, Horus mounts the throne, guaranteeing the rightful rule of Pharaoh. It is the old king resurrected in the new. It was at dawn of the day of the winter solstice, after a night of mourning, that Sokar Osiris made union with the solar disk, the Raw Osiris Meeting, just as the sun struck the top of the Benben stone, the most sacred and probably the oldest monument of Heliopolis. Its image occurs 2 and possibly 3 times on the rim of the Joseph Smith hypocephalus. Its significance will soon become apparent, for it is the stone on which the resurrected bird sits at sunrise. Also significant is the resemblance of this ship to the one in figure 3. Both boats belong to the moon as well as to the sun. For the crouching Sokar bird is also Khonshu, whose name means he who traverses, that the moon in the sky. Like Janus, Khonshu has no myth, and there is no story about him. He is the royal twin elevated to the position of a god. All of which makes clear that Khonshu is first and foremost the moon. The suppliant begs to join his following. Grant that I may be his attendant in the great Nesmet boat on the day of the Wig festival, that my name may be called when he is praised, that my head be crowned with justification, that I may be attached to the subjects of Sokar. Now, our figure 4 goes back to the earliest Egyptian iconography, found on an ivory comb belonging to King Djet, the serpent, from the first dynasty. So this is 2840 BC. On it has been drawn a boat beneath which 2 wings representing the sky are spread. It is the sun ship on the wings of the sky. The 2 outstretched wings above the earth, the sheltering wings of the sky god, from which was later derived the idea of the hawk as the sky god. The inscription with the relief from Edfu adds, the expanse or circumference of the heavens is beneath his wings, where your body is the sky which is adorned with its stars. With the completion of the 8th hour of the Amduat, the god assumes the form of a ram, a viable ba, or energy, on his way out of the underworld. Again, figure 4 marks the turning point. The 8 bas are always drawn directly over the emerging Sokar. Now, the hawk in figure 4 is indeed the rising sun emerging from the lower regions, faithfully preserving the resurrection creation motive of the whole hypocephalus. So fascinating how it kind of shows that resurrection and moving all the way through the transition things for those big sections up there at the top. So amazing. Here's some more things to learn about this figure 4, in fact. In the Berlin book of Wandering Through Eternity, which is related to the book of Breathings, we see the bird of light as messenger of the Lord of the horizon, making his rounds between the 2 worlds. So that figure 4 is dealing with the expanse of space and things, but it also symbolizes the bringing a message, basically, that messenger between the 2 worlds, pulling things together. Hugh Nibley also said this about figure 4. He says, the third most significant thing about figure 4, according to Joseph Smith, is its office in answering to the measuring of time, namely by the cycles and the revolutions of the heavens. Since all these figures mark both the completion and initiation of various life cycles, time is of the essence, and the figure of the Sokar ship is the most important agent of coordination. It was at the said festival or jubilee that the bird was borne forth in procession on his ship. It is specifically figure 4 that coordinates the funeral with the astral theme by its calendrical significance, that is, as the primordial measurement of time. So as it's going through these phases, it's also helping us understand that measurement and concept of time. And realize time is a very relative thing. The best way to understand about how time works for us is understanding that time is a function of gravity. And what that means basically is the more gravity you feel, that the more there's that effect that pulls everything to the center, the slower time goes. So the more gravity, the slower time. The less gravity, the faster the time goes. Now, that might sound crazy that time would be different in space versus on the Earth, or on a different planet versus what's on planet Earth. But it's true. In fact, there's a famous study that was done by NASA where they took 2 clocks. These are atomic clocks, so they set them to be really, 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 really exact, like 1,000th of a second. They're exact in their timing, basically. They put one in mission control on Earth. They put the other one on a spaceship, and they sent it to space to go around the Earth for a week in 0 gravity and then come back. It came back a week later, still tracking at literally the exact same timing as the other clock. So both clocks were in sync as far as their timing, but the clock that went to space was now 5 minutes faster than the one that was on the ground, even though they're tracking at the same time. So we see examples of this if you watch the movie, I think it was Interstellar, where they go through the wormhole to find the other planets because the Earth is falling apart and dying. There's a one planet that they go to, and it's like 2 feet of water everywhere, but then there's this giant wave where most of the water is coming at them. It's a couple 100 feet tall wave coming at them. If you remember, they were down on that planet for 45 minutes to them. So they got their stuff, they got off on the ship, and they got out of there just in time. When they went back to the space station, they'd realized that the guy that was left on the rest of the space shuttle up in space, he had aged like 20 years, when to them they thought it was 45 minutes. So time is relative. It is quite relative. And so they're talking about how this is relative to our Earth and how we calculate things. So gravity is an important part of that, because time is just a function of gravity, basically. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Understanding this a little bit about the 1,000 years concept. Okay. So far so good for Smith. All that seems quite obvious, but what about the next statement? Also a numerical figure in Egyptian signifying 1,000. So remember, this is figure 4, okay, signifying 1,000. Now, professional Egyptologists have protested to the author, this is to Hunibli, that there is nothing known to them to justify attributing the number 1,000 to figure 4. Yet here, if ever, the Joseph Smith explanation is right on target. The woman Nut, the sky goddess of the outspread wings, has a peculiar epithet, and it is the same name as that given to the ship in figure 4, which means literally 1,000 are her souls, or the one with 1,000 souls. The 1,000 souls are stars, and she is so called because the stars are her children. A pyramid text says, "Nut have taken to yourself every god who has his own ship, and have instructed them in the starry sky, so that they will not depart from you as stars. Do not let N be moved far from you in your name of heaven." So fascinating that there actually is evidence of that number 1,000 being related with the goddess Nut, that also has this concept and this symbol of the hawk. Now, Obelish, let's get into that, measuring to the time of Obelish. Remember, that was mentioned also in figure 2, called the Egyptians, the thing that stands next to Kolob is called Obelish. And now we're measuring the time of Obelish. Now, Obelish, according to Hunibli, is manifestly on the main circuit with Kolob, figure 2 being halfway between figures 3 and 4. We have passed from galaxy to solar system to the Earth's sublunary authority, kind of showing how that evolves. Now let's get into the next part of this about the lotus flower a little bit more. Okay. Murnane has also pointed out the prominence of the lotus blossom in the cult as representing the coming forth of the light that is latent in Sokar and blossoms forth when the beams of light reach the depths of the underworld. The lotus signifies the new creation, order out of chaos. This is of particular interest since the lotus, which appears on the altar of the ship in figure 3 of the Joseph Smith Hypocephalus, is an anomaly. That is, as is that in Facsmilie 1. So remember, in the corner of Facsmilie 1, there is a lotus flower that's shown there, and that's the only time, almost the only time it's ever seen in those similar ones in other Egyptian writings. Same in here in Facsmilie, or figure number 3 in Facsmilie 2. It's rare. But he says the unusual frequency of the lotus in all 3 facsimiles is noteworthy and plausible. In Facsmilie 1, it was claimed by Egyptologists that Joseph Smith had inserted it, but the discovery of the original proved that that was not so. It belongs where we see it. Among the many symbols of the lotus, for the Egyptians, it is especially the agent of the daily renewal of the sun. It is also the heraldic flower of Lower Egypt. As to the relationship of Kolob and Obelish, it hooks figure 4 in on the main circuit with Obelish. Figure 2, as the go-between, Khonshu's link to Ra Amun is the bond between the moon and the sun, while figure 1, as noted above, represents the great cosmic center. The upper part of the hypocephalus brings together sun, moon, and stars in their various relationships. How cool is that? It pulls those together, shows us more of a universal effect of things, the progression through stuff, and thinking about the progression of stars to the moon to the sun, realizing the 3 degrees of glory. There's a progression in moving forward, coming closer to God. And in figure 3, the one representing Celestial Kingdom has the grand key words in it as well, and the other 2 don't. So fascinating how that works out. You could also look at this as the ruler, God the Father rules in the Celestial Kingdom, Jesus Christ or Jehovah rules in the terrestrial kingdom, and the Holy Spirit, which the hawk symbol could symbolize the spirit, the energy, is the ruler of the lower kingdom as well. The 3 degrees of glory are right there. Something interesting about this as well, this progression says, our Facsmilie 2 represents graphically and symbolically the process by which life moves from the highest to the lowest realms in order of the numbers given by Joseph Smith. I think they're speculative, of course. As I said, these are not pictures but abstract symbols, but they couldn't serve as such if they didn't give us some hint of what they're referring to. But there isn't nearly enough pictorially to justify anyone's guessing. We must have explanations from the Egyptians themselves. The figure I want to discuss is the very last one in this process I've been talking about. The most enigmatical of all, it's these figures here. It's the long panel here, and at the end comes these figures of the leaf. The plant is a lotus, mostly in the herbivore and the carnivore in different order sometimes. It doesn't make any difference because this is the cycle of life on Earth it's talking about. It's going to tell us how it gets started. See, this has to do with the incarnation of all sorts of things, and this is a well-known figure. There are lots of cases of it. Mortzgat has collected them in Babylonian seals, in Mesopotamian seals. It is that the herbivore eats the plant, doesn't he? The carnivore eats the herbivore, and the plant eats the carnivore. That's Samson's riddle. Out of the killer came strength. The lion dies and rots, and out of him grows the grass and the plants and so forth. So we have this life cycle. How do we initiate it? How do we get it going? They like to discuss it here and now. This is the very last one. Well, that desired reversal is twice represented here around the rim, where we have our picture of the Ben stone. So this is the outer rim, basically. Yes, the benben, which is the perch or monument or obelisk of the phoenix bird. Remember the phoenix bird? In Egyptian, it's the benben. Every 500 years he dies. He's immolated and becomes nothing but ashes, and then he rises from the ashes. This is the legend of the phoenix. We know that it was very convincing to the Christians. First Clement quotes it as the strongest proof of the resurrection. The phoenix story is the bird that goes to Riga and comes back to Egypt every 500 years to Heliopolis, sacrifices himself on the pyre, and rises from it again. But how do you do it? As I say, our Facsmilie 2 represents the process by which life moves from the highest to the lowest realm. Then, right at the end, in the final figure of the long panel, we get these three you see. You have the biological cycle, the food chain, in which the vegetation is eaten by the herbivore is eaten by the carnivore dies and rots, and after the lion rots, out of the lion comes the strength, the new life. So we find things suddenly reversing their courses in figures 5, 6, and 7. So this is the first, that the ones that are upside down, that's what he's talking about here. So 5, 6, and 7. Well, just closing here, I'll list some references here. We can find references to the bee here. Number 2, this is Wepwawet. He's holding the staff with Wepwawet, the dog that leads him. The name of this figure for the Egyptians is called Shushabilt, the one who follows the bee. Notice he is a wanderer. He wanders in both directions and he's holding the staff. This is his dog, Wepwawet, who leads the way into foreign lands and so forth. So he is the follower of the bee. Figure 7 is Min. Min here is the one who founded Coptus, the oldest settlement in Egypt. He gave Egypt its name. He founded it as the son of the great woman, Egyptus. He, this Min, has a garden there and he has beehives. The purpose of his garden is to feed the bees, and the bees feed the garden. So he gets things going. He is the bee god, figure 7. So if you notice, figure 7 has kind of a hive next to it. Now figure 6, as I say, is Samson's riddle. Okay, figure 6 is the 4 Canopic Jars over there on the left. Out of the killer comes strength. The lion has killed everything. The lion of the desert, or the face of the lion, is the very symbol of death. And out of that comes the strength, the honey. The bee brings it out. The Philistines had the same story. Figure 5 is the cow. The bee came from the cow. It was out of the cow that the bee makes its nectar. The manure of the cow is sacred because the bee gets their honey from it. They convert it into honey. What an operation, see? I don't want to take up any more time, but again, in front of him is the dove, the Holy Ghost in the form of a dove, as a messenger. He is delivering a message to the heavens, as it says here. And again, these are the doves, the oracles of Ammon, that come from Egypt and give the notice of the resurrection. So figures 5, 6, 7, and 8 are the 4 gods. There go back to a very early American writer, Shelem Balaam, of that Mayan document that shows how swarms of bees, different colors from the different directions, 4 swarms of bees come and establish the people in the land and so forth. So if we look at this, to just go over and talk about what Joseph Smith has for these figures as well as we see this. Figure 5 is called in Egyptian Inish Go'an Dash. This is one of the governing planets also, and is said by the Egyptians to be the sun, and to borrow its light from Kolob through the median of Kai-A Vanrash, which is the grand key, or in other words, the governing power, which governs 15 other fixed planets or stars, as also Flois, or the moon, the earth and the sun in their annual revolutions. This planet receives its power through the medium of Kli Flosisis, or Ha-Kokau beam, the stars represented by numbers 22 and 23, receiving light from the revolutions of Kolob. So when you look at those, it's absolutely fascinating when you look at that figure 5, even though it's the cow, this is what he's talking about here. Now figure 6 represents this earth in its 4 quarters. Those are the 4 Canopic Jars. Those Canopic Jars, to give an understanding, whenever somebody died, there were these 4 jars that were carved out for them, one with each of the different gods. There was the hawk, the ape, the jackal, and then one more. And they eventually converted those jars, not just statues, to give like little small figurines that were buried with the mummies in their in or around their sarcophagus, but they were the canopic jars as well. And what they would do is those jars would hold the heart and the brain and the intestines and things of the dead body. They would pull, in the mummification process, they would pull most of the inner organs out and then save the important ones in those jars and then put them outside the sarcophagus, but in the tomb with the mummy. And so then they could get those organs back in the resurrection when they go back, basically. Those jars are also represented, if you remember, in figure 1 as well, the canopic jars. Now, figure 7 represents God sitting upon his throne, revealing through the heavens the grand key words of the priesthood, as also the sign of the Holy Ghost unto Abraham in the form of a dove. So that's what they're talking about there in that figure 7. So again, the grand key words come in, and as we look in figure 5, talking about how these key words affect the other worlds. This is kind of explaining, here's this law or this principle that governs from those other worlds, but it emanates from a different world and goes out to that one. So thus giving more credence to the idea of, instead of thinking of the whole idea of Kolob and Kokau being from a three-dimensional space, we have to think from a multi-dimensional space standpoint. So if you have thoughts or ideas on any of this, I'd love to get it in the comments what you think about these things as we're going through and talking about them. Now let's talk about how these sections are now upside down. They're going to the right, but upside down, basically. So that's that continual round. So this is another quote from Hugh Nibley. He says, a century ago, Philippe J. de Horac displayed insight into the hypocephalus, which has never been challenged. Quote, all these different symbols simply represent, on the one side the female, on the other the male element, to express the idea of eternal generative power. Close quote. The lower part of the circle represents the lower or dark hemisphere from which the sun emerged to mark the beginning of time. The wedge-dot eye conveys the idea of the renewal of a period, like the full moon, the solstice, the equinoxes, etc., and it designates here the accomplishment of the period of resurrection, always assimilated with the daily and annual revival of the sun. The circle is divided to represent the two celestial hemispheres. All details refer to the resurrection and the renewed birth after death, and this idea is more particularly symbolized by the course of the sun, the living image of divine generation. In the Egyptian temple, there is a tendency to harmonize two opposites, which is fundamental to Egyptian thought, reflected throughout the plan of the temple. There is also a vertical or a right and left division in the hypocephali, as well as a horizontal division with the same connotation. The day and night ships of heaven and counter heaven, respectively, are also the left and right eyes. The male Shu, the female Tefnut. Elements, sun and moon, etc. Throughout the Egyptian temple ceremonies, everything to the right of the worshiper has the idea of light, of life. Everything on the left represents the idea of darkness and death. This right and left division is as basic to the hypocephalus as the up and down one. Thus, the two dominant male figures 1 and 2, are both divided neatly down the middle, each facing both right and left. So they're catching both sides and paying attention to both. A well-known characteristic of Egyptian thinking is the duality of all phenomena. It is dramatized in the two kingdoms, two crowns, two thrones, two palaces, two tombs, etc. of the kings. The calendric symbolism of Gem Aten was to impress with the yearly cycle of the season of months, days, in a duality of ritual at sunrise and sunset. It requires a reverse or counter heaven as well. The most prominent belief was that we have a complete universe of sky and earth, which has its counterpart reversed below it. This is a reminder that the function of the hypocephalus is to maintain ties between that which is in heaven and that which is in the tomb, a joining of the worlds above and below clearly designated in the opposing parts of the disk. It is also a reminder of those accounts in the book of Moses and Abraham in which peculiar emphasis is placed on the importance of division in the creative process. The sun is to rule over the day and the moon over the night, to divide the light from the darkness. It's Moses 2:18. For life to appear on land, it was also necessary to divide the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. It's Abraham 4:7. In many hypocephali, the two ships sailing in the solar upper part of the circle are matched by two ships, or sometimes one, sailing in the lower half. Quote, the gods organized the lights in the heaven, in the expanse of the heaven, and caused them to divide the day from the night, and organized them to be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. That's Abraham 4:14. Now the same thing applies to human reproduction. And from that time forth, the sons and daughters of Adam began to divide two and two in the land. It's Moses 5:3. Recalling the same order by which the animals entered the ark, as well as the primal Ogdode of Heliopolis, in which each god has his female counterpart. So that's very, very important to think about. Now let's talk about this cow in figure 5 a little bit more. It is part of a family group which includes the standing female figure with her back turned to figure 7. So if you notice in there, God is facing that way, the cow is facing that way, and the 4 canopic jars are facing that way. So they're all technically, except for the cow, they're all facing the opposite direction. They're going the same to the right when they should be mainly going to the left appropriately. But it says here, she is obviously ministering to the cow. Now this pair, in fact, is perhaps the most uniform and unchanging motif on all the hypocephali. It is not surprising that this is the longest and most involved of all of Joseph Smith's explanations, for this is by all odds the most important figure on the disc, and we must pay her close attention, for when all elements of the hypocephalus are stripped away in order of their importance, it is always the cow that remains central and indispensable. The great cow is Hathor, or Isis, says Plutarch, and Apuleius addresses her as the Queen of Heaven and the fertile image of the universal divine parent. Though these are the characterizations of classical writers, the cow was no local deity later exalted to glory following the familiar pattern. Hers is a non-localized myth whose origin was in the sky. This cow of heaven is the prehistoric mate of the celestial bull. See in the rim of Facsmilie 2, figure 18. And may even account for the universal designation of the Milky Way. But though she stands out in bold simplicity, the divine cow is a strange composite of contrary conceptions, as Rudolf Anthes puts it. Actually, the cow represents an entire series of major divinities, all of which can be represented by the celestial cow, of which the sun is the calf. She is Mutwort, the primal flood and the first living thing, called Methier, the great flood water, the cosmic personification of the primal waters. And remember, you got to realize the history of the area is they have 3 seasons. They have the inundation, water suddenly rise up in the Nile and flood the whole area, providing lots of nutrients and minerals and things to the land. Then the water subsides, and now they have abundant growth and crops. And then they have the harvest and the dry season before it goes into the inundation again, basically. So they see this idea of a great flood and expanse as an important part of their creation, the beginning of it. It says her story is told in the book of Abraham, Abraham 1, 23 and 24, where the cow is a metaphor for Aegyptus, the great queen mother, the first to enter Egypt after the flood when it was still all wetlands. The classic representation shows the head and forepart of a huge longhorn cow emerging from a veritable forest of papyrus. See figure 9 to get more, if I remember right. All of this is simply following the example of the sun, whose rejuvenating journey can take place within the body of the sky goddess. It is ritually repeated for all the dead who, by entering the waters of Nun, are rejuvenated and slough off their previous existence and put on another. The pyramid texts teach us that the heavenly cow may help the dead to rise up and ascend to heaven, even as she once carried the royal mummy of Raw Osiris to heaven on her back. a scene vividly depicted on a number of hypocephali. As noted above, it occupies one whole side of the Nash hypocephalus. Joseph Smith also tells us that figure 5 is the sun, no problem. From beginning, the mother of the sun with the newborn disc rising between her horns, a design in evidence in prehistoric times. It was an easy step to becoming the sun itself. As early as the Old Kingdom, the cow appears as the female equivalent of Ra. At Apet in Luxor, where the mother cow was worshipped as Hathor of Coptus, she was called the son of the two worlds, that is, both of Horus, the son of Osiris, and Amun-Ra, the son of Thebes. Her horns, flanked by the same two feathers that our figure 2 wears as the sun at the zenith, show that the cow resurrects the sun as well as the human race. It is instructive to see how Brother Joseph explains the cow. First, it should be noted that there is not the slightest indication in the Joseph Smith hypocephalus that this or any other figure might have anything to do with the starry heavens. Yet, that is the prophet's main concern and the principal quality of the cow. It is necessary to consider this cow as an emblem of heaven where millions of stars are gathered together, named after living beings. Joseph Smith's main points are 1. That the cow is the sun, that it borrows its light, that the borrowing is done through intermediaries. The terms borrowing, medium, and governing applied throughout the system are here most explicit, bespeaking a hierarchical order of shared energy. There is a key or control to the whole thing, the idea expressed by the label of Ka-i Vanrash. It is said to be the governing power which governs 15 other fixed planets or stars. We should note here that the word star has been used freely by ancient and moderns alike to designate any bright object in the heavens, from the sun to a meteorite. Now, included in the same system is the local family or group of the moon, the earth, and the sun in their annual revolutions. This is the only time the moon is specifically mentioned in the explanation. All these bodies are interconnected in their motions and exchanges of energies, and all are ultimately dependent on Kolob. So again, fascinating to think about it when you think of a multidimensional world, basically, that one world has the controlling power and it emanates through to the other ones. There are some speculations that even gravity itself, the graviton, comes from another dimension, which then controls and influences our world and our dimensions and our time to go through our seasons and patterns and times and things. So here's a little bit more that we have, and this comes out of Michael Rhodes' talk in 1977. He says, a cow wearing a sun disk and double plumes with a menet necklace, symbol of Hathor. This is the cow eyelet, mentioned in chapter 162 of the Book of the Dead, which should be drawn on a piece of new papyrus. This picture of a cow is common to almost all hypocephali. Ihet is a form of Hathor, the personification of the power of nature. She is also connected to Mehwerwet, or Greek Mether, another cow goddess who symbolized the sky. The name Mehwerwet means great fullness, i.e., the primeval waters from which Ra first arose. Especially instructive is a section of chapter 17 from the Book of the Dead. I have seen this Ra who was born yesterday from the buttocks of Meheret. If he prospers, I prosper. If I prosper, he prospers. What is this? This is the primeval waters of heaven. Another reading shows it is the image of the eye of Ra in the morning at his daily birth. Now for Mehwerwet, she is the Ujet eye of Ra. Standing behind the cow is an unidentifiable goddess whose head is an Ujet eye and who is holding a lotus blossom, again the symbol of rebirth. In relation to these characters, Joseph speaks of a governing planet receiving light through a medium of governing power. No particular nexus, however, between the symbolism of the powers of nature or the primeval waters and that governing readily commends itself. So pretty fascinating how those do connect together. So something that's interesting here, few have failed to notice, along with Philip de Horac, that the under part of the hypocephalus, a third or even half of the area, is Chthonian or earthly, While the upper half is male and celestial, the lower part belongs to the Hathor cow, who was Isis, and the figures around her denote the womb or depths of the underworld where conception and resurrection both begin. Pretty fascinating here, huh? Now, in this one as well, in figure 5, it talks about 15 other fixed planets. Let's talk about this number 15. The number here plainly belongs to the cow, but what about the 15 stars? The number 15 cannot be derived from any holy number of the Egyptians, writes Herman Keyes, and yet it presents a surprising analogy with the 15 false doors in the Great Wall of the Dozier complex at Saqqara, which was designed by the great Imhotep himself, in the Festival of the Heavens of Heliopolis in mind, following the older pattern of the White Wall of the Thinite Palace of Memphis. Strangely enough, this number 15 keeps turning up all along and nobody knows why, though it always represents passing from one gate or door to another. Long after Dozier, Amenhotep III, built a wall for his royal circumambulation at the said festival, marking the inauguration of a new age of the world. It also had 15 gates. The great Ennead, which resides in Karnak, swelled to 15 members. It was structured in 3 phases. 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8, which is 15 altogether. Etienne Drayton associates this with the dividing of eternity in the drama of Edfu into years, years into months, months into 15 units, these units into hours, and they into minutes. Furthermore, the idea of 15 mediums or conveyors may be represented on the 15 limestone tablets of the Book of the Underworld found by Theodore Davies and Howard Carter in the tomb of Hatshepsut. She's one of the female pharaohs. Let us recall that the basic idea, as Joseph Smith explains it, is that 15 other fixed planets or stars act as a medium for conveying the governing power. Coming down to a later time of the Egyptian Gnostics, we find the 15 helpers of the 7 virgins of light in the Coptic Pistis Sophia, who expanded themselves in the regions of the 12 saviors and the rest of the angels of the mist. Each according to its glory will rule with me in an inheritance of light. In an equally interesting Coptic text, 2nd Jew, there are also 15 parastati who serve with the 7 virgins of the light, who are with the Father of all fatherhoods in the treasury of the light. They are the light virgins who are in the middle or the midst, meaning that they are go-betweens. The parastati are those who conduct one through a series of ordinances, just as the 15 stars receive and convey light. In all this, we never get away from cosmology and astronomy. In the old Slavonic secrets of Enoch, 4 great stars, each having 1,000 stars under it, go with 15 myriads of angels, all moving, to quote Joseph Smith, together with the moon, the earth, and the sun in their annual revolutions. In the Book of Gates, one of those mystery texts reserved for the most secret rites of the greatest kings, we see, as Gustave Jacquier describes it, a long horizontal bar with a bull's head at either end supported by 8 mummiform personages and carrying 7 other genies. These 15 figures are designated as carriers or bearers, and the bar is the body of the bull extended to give them all room. A rope enters the bull's mouth at one end and exits at the other, and on the end of this rope there is a sunbark being towed by a total of 8 personages designated as stars. Remember, that's the sunbark is that curved boat that we see in figure 3 and figure 4. Just as the ship travels through the 15 conveyor stars on the underside of the cow, the 2 heads of the bull make him interchangeable with the 2-headed lion Aker or Ruti, who guards the gate. Aker, writes Jacquier, is a personification of the gates of the earth by which the sun must pass in the evening and in the morning. He is the same as the 2-headed Janus, the gate god, whom we have already met. That's figure 2, basically. So some pretty amazing stuff, really amazing stuff. What's fascinating too, So he's talking about, I like this idea that he's talking about how the governing principles come from God or from this location down, and then they go through these 15 stars that are governed, connected by the main person, by God, and then are governed to everything else. If you think of our 12 apostles and a first presidency of 3, that's 15. So we could even say symbolically it's showing God teaches his apostles and his apostles teach us. Kind of a cool symbolism in there that just came to my mind as I was reading through this, going through this. Really cool. All right, so let's talk about the apes now. These are a little bit more about figures 22 and 23. We're kind of jumping ahead a little bit with here, but they tie in with all these things that we're talking about here, basically. Inseparable from our figure 1 are the reverential apes on either side of him. On the other hypocephali, they're sometimes 2 in number, sometimes 4, 6, or 8, sometimes standing and sometimes seated. They are identified as stars. As early as the pyramid text, they are designated as the beloved sons of Sothis Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. It is assumed that the position of the apes shows them warming their hands as they greet the rays of the rising sun after the cold desert night and seeming to shield their eyes from the glory of the sunrise. So they are stars receiving light from a greater star, as Joseph Smith's explanation declares. There was nothing to indicate to Joseph Smith that they are stars, yet along with the pyramid text, we have a vignette in the 17th chapter of the Book of the Dead, in which each of these apes is preceded by a star. The 8 apes in the New Kingdom stand for the Ogdod, the 8 primal gods, or the great council which met in the presence of Amun at the creation. Amun, as the president of the council in heaven, would make up the Ennead, and there is, as one might expect, a cosmic significance to the quartet of apes, in which Gustave Jacquier finds a singular parallelism between their names and those given to the primal chaos in Genesis. So the tohu, the bohu of the Hebrew creation story match the nun and hehu of the Egyptian, according to Jacquier, while Hebrew hosek is plainly related to the Egyptian keku. In reading the Old Testament, Jacquier finds it hard to believe that the Elohist author did not draw from a Hermopolitan source. Horapollo tells us that the special office of the apes was to function as timekeepers or time reckoners. The sitting cynocephalus, according to him, at each equinox urinates 12 times a day and 12 times a night. During the rest of the year, he gives a cry 12 times a day on the hour every hour. The seated ape then is in charge of both the water clock and scales. In the Ptolemaic period, the Egyptians wrote the determinative of the word for hour by a heart-shaped plumb bob suspended from a carpenter's square. So that's pretty cool. The purpose of this was to make sure that the post supporting the scale was perfectly upright, as is shown in Joseph Smith Papyrus 4. This new element suggests that the apes, which face each other, worshiping the central figure, both on the morning side and on the evening side on all hypocephali, establish, among other things, a sense of perfect balance in the universe. Time, space, and matter are measurably related. Finally, each of our apes is crowned with a disk and a crescent, the meaning of the sun and the moon at the new moon marking the beginning of the month. The best-known office of the cynocephalus apes is in representing Thoth as the moon god. It is significant that the apes are more than mere symbols. They are actual creatures doing what God's creatures do, as they also serve him. The same applies to the lowliest of all, the serpents, that seem to stand on their tails in front of each ape. In better preserved hypocephali, they are more conspicuous and are shown in various positions, usually one contained in a womb or amniotic sac of some sort. Sometimes, however, both snakes are in such bags, and sometimes both are free, the one crawling horizontally and the other vertically. Plainly, this has to do with the bringing forth of life, and what the two opposing serpents most readily suggest are the coupling snakes of the cadices, the staff of Hermes the medic, which is a sign both of copulation and of the life-saving servant, a vivid reminder of the bronze servant in the wilderness, which overcomes the poison of the other serpents. That's Numbers 21:9, the Moses story. To this, we may add the uraeus of the Pharaoh, which overcomes the serpents that oppose him. Added to the two flanking serpents, the one of the amniotic sac and the other on the loose, we have the most hypocephalized serpents on the crowns of figures 1 and 2, either issuing above the horns on both the two-feathered Amun crown and the Atef crown worn by figure number 1, usually crowned with solar discs, or in various other combinations, now on one crown only, and now on the other, and now wearing sun discs, and now without them, etc. So some fascinating stuff. We get to learn about those apes in there as well. Now let's talk about that long panel down there, figures 5, 6, and 7 that are down there that we've been talking about. This is an example of an art form the Egyptians were fond of, depicting a procession of events by a series of drawings showing a progression both in time and space. Such are the vignettes of the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and the Book of the Two Ways, and in various historic battle scenes such as the Battle of Kadesh. The panel, comprised of figures 5, 6, and 7, is one of the longest and fullest presentations in all the hypocephali. It is also the most often reproduced, the most unvarying, changeless part of all hypocephali, the most important, and the only series of scenes which the Egyptians themselves have fully explained for us. So these 4 standing mummiform figures are the 4 sons of Horus, basically, or with a man's head, with an ape's head, with a jackal's head, and with a hawk's head. That's man's head, that was the other one. They were the gods of the 4 quarters of the earth, and later came to be regarded as presiding over the 4 cardinal points. They also were guardians of the viscera of the dead, and their images were carved on the 4 canopic jars into which the internal organs were placed. Joseph Smith simply states that they represent the earth and its 4 quarters. Behind the 4 standing figures, there is a lotus blossom, a lion, and a sheep. This is the hieroglyphic name of one of the strange gods of chapter 162 of the Book of the Dead, which is tentatively rendered Surt Miwi Sri. Just what God is meant is not known. So they have a name, but they don't know who it describes, basically, is what that means. So let's talk a bit more about those here. Hunibly had some comments to say as well. So behind the 4 canoptic figures are 3 enigmatic objects often omitted from this panel in other hypocephali when the space is too crowded for them. They are the lotus leaf, the lion, and the ram. Fortunately, when they have to be left out, their place is regularly taken by a less bulky substitute, the scarab. This is particularly welcome because it shows us exactly what the function of the missing figures really is. For the Kefri beetle, proclaiming the possibility of changing form while preserving identity, shows that the life process is to be carried on from one form of being to another. The Egyptians were fond of representing the idea by polywogs and beetles. So it's the same person, just different form, like a polywog converts into a frog, basically. Marie-Louise Reiner notes that the lotus blossom, the lion, and the ram symbolize the gods of rising, midday, and setting sun. That is Ra, Kefri, and Atum. Remember, we talked about that also. It also suggests the food chain in which the ram eats the plant, the lion eats the ram, and the lion, as Samson reminds us in Judges 14:14, in turn becomes the food base for the new vegetation. That this is a valid interpretation is strongly indicated in the Sumerian record, where the 3 figures occur frequently combined in the oldest glyphic art of the Near East. Anton Morgat has explained how everywhere the carnivore, the ruminant, and the green plant are found in combinations on the oldest seals, reliefs, and vessels of Mesopotamia, whence the motif spread to the other parts of the world. So fascinating how just that concept, if you look over there to that side, there's the flower, there's the lion, and then there's the ram, and how those go through, basically, or flower, ram, lion, excuse me, and that kind of shows this circle of life, this continuation pattern that's happening here. So fascinating, so fascinating. All right, so here's a little bit more here. The false messenger further asserts that he is announced at the horizon by the Aku spirits and the 4 powers, and that he is held in awe by the four Akus and the four powers, or Sekmenu, and that his own four members are composed by Atum. This calls to our attention, if a bit prematurely, the four ram's heads on one neck of figure 1 in most hypocephali, as well as the four creative canoptic figures found in almost all hypocephali. The rascal also claims that he is one of the serpents created by the Eye of Atum before Isis was on hand to bear Horus. The serpents appear flanking the central figure and are discussed below. So just some little bit of a tidbit that I found from Hugh Nibley that gives a more insight into that. He expressed a lot of concepts we've talked about, but just some pretty amazing things in there. Now let's get into the Canopic Jars a little bit more in detail to understand these. So we're still on figure 6. If you're going to have either a birth or rebirth, it will require the bringing together of the elements of this earth. These elements are represented by the four canoptic figures, or sons of Horus, designated as figure 6. They represent, says Joseph Smith in his explanation to Facsmilie 2, the earth and its four quarters. In Facsmilie 1, as the four jars under the bier, they have a historical and geographical significance, being the gods of four regions of the earth embraced in the worship of Pharaoh. The history we have treated elsewhere. In Facsmilie 2, their function is primarily cosmic. The canoptic figures are of the earth, earthly. They hold the most perishable internal organs of the individual. The mummified body is an empty husk until the spirit returns to it, when the vital parts must also be included to restore everything to its proper and perfect form. They were removed and placed in jars for safekeeping. Inscriptions on the four jars sometimes contain prayers to the divinities to whom the protection of the internal organ is especially entrusted. Namely the four sons of Horus and the four great goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket. The four represent various things, but always with the idea of resurrection. Though they contain only certain organs, they represent the restoration of the entire body. The four carry on the same work of completion and perfection as the wedge-at eye. Indeed, Theodule Deveria saw in figure 1 of Facsmilie 2, with its four faces, the spirit of the four elements, the four winds, or the four cardinal points, the soul of the material world. Following Deveria, Philippe de Horac also saw the spirit of the four winds, or four cardinal points. At Opid, the genies of the four winds in that capacity go back to the pyramid texts. It has often been noted that these figures are the four creatures of Ezekiel and Revelation, as well as the symbols of the four evangelists. Jacquier notes that there is a singular parallelism between the names of the four cynocephalic apes, personifications of the primeval abyss, and the four words employed in the account of the creation at the beginning of Genesis. The names of the four sons of Horus are also star gods that follow behind the Big Dipper. Cyprian, in his work on Zion, maintains that Adam had his name from the four cardinal points. The Jewish tradition held that Adam was composed of earth, taken from the four corners of the world, representing the four basic elements, earth, water, air, and fire. The four humors of man in medical alchemy, and for the Egyptians, the four basic colors and the four races of man. The name Adam in Hebrew is related to red earth, Adamah, the pure, undefiled earth of the Egyptian red rock country, called by them Desheret, the red land, the desert. The canoptic figures then represent the basic elements of which all earthly things are composed and which must be brought together in correct shape and proportion to achieve the birth or rebirth of an earthly creature. This takes us back to Genesis. The Egyptian names of the four cyanocephalic apes surrounding the throne of the central figure of the hypocephalus, only two are shown in Facsmilie 2, suggest so strongly the Tahu, Bohu, Bosek, and Ruha Elohim of the Hebrew creation story in Genesis that Jacquier can declare that it is difficult to believe that the Elohist, author of the Genesis creation account, did not borrow from a Heliopolitan source. They represent, according to Jacquier, chaos, darkness, and space dominating matter unorganized. We should recall at this point that the hypocephalus is meant to go back to the first creation. So absolutely fascinating. Some of the things we get to learn in this from Joseph Smith. And as we look at the Egyptian understanding of it and what Joseph Smith has given us, it's not very far off at all.